Um, and so I just wanted to, start off by sharing with you a little bit of a story about her. She is probably one of the strongest influencers of my, of my life. And it was actually where I first met her and I was able to spend some time with her was at USM. And it was in 2000, maybe 1999 or 98, where we hosted her, the Office of the President. And I believe it may have been the honors program and likely the English department. But I was part of the hosting group that brought her to campus, and I was able to spend, a solid 3 days with her. After having, read her work, throughout my undergraduate degree, which was in women's studies. I had a concentration in women's studies. So I, was thinking about today's discussion, and I'm supposed to be speaking to this paper that I published that in 2019, which I will be. But, I wanted to, before I heard the news of Bell Hook's passing, which she was only 69 years old, which is also really cause for us to stop and critically think, because it reminds me of the painful reality of a earlier life expectancy for racialized and Black women. And, it's an even earlier life expectancy for Indigenous women, a shorter life expectancy earlier. So anyhow, I thought, wow, I started out thinking I want to share some of the knowledge and, talk a bit about what influenced the writing of this paper. And, I've introduced into the literature this concept called anti-racist conviction. And really at the very foundation of that is feminist theory and the influences I've had by, feminist scholars like Bell Hooks. And she, by far and wide, has had the most significant influence, as perhaps any other writer and scholar. So when she came to USM, I had just started my career there, and I had just graduated with my undergraduate degree. I had come back from a master's degree at Harvard. And I had this job at the University of Southern Maine as the director of multicultural affairs. And we were hosting her and as a visiting scholar at the time. And I was walking around campus with her and, hosting her the territory. And she had asked me what it was like, where all the other Native people were, and what that was like working as, one of the only Native people, in at USM at the time. And so I had just explained to her, I was quite exhausted at that time. And she then went on to ask me what it was like, being at Harvard and there not being many Native people. So we got onto this topic of, being in the margins and oftentimes being the only either Indigenous woman or Black woman in such a predominantly white spaces. And she articulated, in the discussion, what I was deeply feeling. And she had said that as a new faculty member, when she started her academic career, she would go to, she would be in faculty meetings, and she specifically spoke to like committee meetings where she was, the only racialized person on the committee. And she said she would, or the faculty council, or, places like this where she was with colleagues and peers that had a PhD, but she was oftentimes the only Black woman. She said that she would go home early on in her career and be very tired, and she named it as depression, and she would have to take naps after work, after she'd get back from campus. And she said she had an epiphany, and as she was writing about decolonization, and she had offered to me some profound advice at that time in my life, and she had explained that the moment at which she started speaking up and talking about what was on her mind, and it was like, she said her body woke up, and she said she would come home and she didn't have to take that nap. Like, she was in the meeting and she actually just said what was on her mind, and she didn't monitor so much, and she detached from this notion of being an imposter. Because I had shared with her, my feelings of being an imposter, at Harvard, and thinking that when I first got there, I was scared to speak up because I thought, gosh, they're going to find out about me, that I don't really belong here. And so we were sort of going back and forth and talking, and she said, this is where I realized that she goes, what I was actually doing in retrospect, I was decolonizing. I was decolonizing my own space, as a Black woman, and in a predominantly, white context. And she had just offered that to me, for me to consider that. And it had a tremendous influence on not just my thinking, but my practice, and that's what I love, and just acknowledging the Libra committee for your focusing in on practice within this thematic, I think is really awesome and timely. And so I wanted to just honor her life, and may she rest in power, and she may rest in peace and rest in love, knowing that she had such a tremendous influence over so many of us, and she continues to. So I rely as an Indigenous feminist scholar very heavily on critical theory and critical thinking. And I'll share some of that with you today. And it's the lens through which I have taken up probably all of my analysis, as an Indigenous scholar. And it's very much rooted in ancestral Wabanaki ways of knowing and being as well, which is probably even more foundational to the foundation of critical theory. So I wanted to share with you a bit about that. And for those of you who are not familiar with bell hooks, please familiarize yourself with bell hooks. Not only is she legendary and an icon, and she is, what I believe a staple to any literary engagement, even at a high school level. And so in terms of teaching, it's just, she's critically important to be familiar with. And so I just wanted to share with you, my favorite book is All About Love. I don't know if you can see this because I've got this. All About Love is something that she wrote, and it has had a tremendous influence on my thinking and my pedagogy. So, and practice. So this particular quote is taken from Teaching Critical Thinking, Practical Wisdom. And thinking is an action for all inspiring intellectuals. Thoughts are their laboratory where one goes to pose questions and find answers, in the place where visions of theory and praxis come together. The heartbeat of critical thinking is the longing to know, to understand how life works. Children are organically predisposed to be critical thinkers. Across the boundaries of race, class, gender, and circumstance, children come into the world of wonder and language consumed with a desire for knowledge. Sometimes they are so eager for knowledge that they become relentless interrogators, demanding. And so as I open up the talk and honor bell hooks, I ask you to think about, as I'm going through the slides and the talk, to maybe consider, how do you know what you know about Maine Indian people, and how does that impact, the way that you may even think and teach and approach materials, Indigenous content or Indigenous students or peoples and communities. So with that, I'm just going to start. And I wanted to just share with you a picture of my family. And this is, again, these are my feminist roots. Because Wabanaki woman knowledge has had a tremendous influence in my thinking as well. And holds the lens through which I see the world, so for me, theory is, how do we make sense of the world around us, right? And so my mom, who is down here on the right, raised up 8 of us, for the very most part, on her own. I'm this little one here. I'm the youngest of these 8 brothers and sisters. And my mother, like so many Indigenous women, find themselves raising their families on their own. And in practice, that as an Indigenous, feminist, this is a very this is a stark reality, for many of our peoples. And so what I want to sort of unpack and walk through is how these socioeconomic, the disproportionality of socioeconomic distress. So for instance, when I say at the beginning that Indigenous women have the shortest life expectancy than any other group in North America, in the United States or Canada, that is a result of the colonial dispossession, right? And so, for me to talk about how I see the issues surrounding the lack of visibility around Indigenous education, I would be amiss to not connect and make sure that we center, how we come to know and understand life around us. And so as an Indigenous scholar, Wabanaki woman knowledge and being raised by this matriarch, my mother, Elizabeth Sockbeson, has had a tremendous influence on my thinking and my practice. Okay. And of course, also my siblings. So I wanted to just share that. And it's such a beautiful family. And out of this, my mother has like over 40 grandchildren and great grandchildren. I think it's over 50 now. So yeah, I want to just acknowledge and thank you, Jeff, for reading the land acknowledgement. And I just wanted to also acknowledge Provost Uzi for bringing this to the fore. Who I've never really heard her self-identify as a feminist, but I think her leadership is so feminist. And for her to have read the first land acknowledgement ever, and you think about this, there's 141 graduation ceremonies at USM, and the first time it being read was by a woman and a leader in higher education. So, I just wanted to shed a little bit of light on that. And it was written by Libby Bischoff and Aaron Whitten. So, just a shout out, an acknowledgement for the need to acknowledge the land, and not just acknowledge the land, but this particular land acknowledgement also acknowledges the land dispossession. Okay. And so that's pretty key, I think, in a responsible and responsive land acknowledgement, which there's lots of talk about how to do that these days. So we could probably create another talk all about that. I want to just start out by, I'll keep the slide up here, but I'm going to read an excerpt from a chapter, a publication that I published, I don't know, within the past 3 or 4 years. But I want to shed light on land dispossession and its connection to this bounty, okay? And specifically the territory that the majority of you are sitting on right now. I'm talking to you from 4,000 miles away at the University of Alberta, where I'm a prof at, but my homeland and where I come from. So even in my language, I would start out introducing myself by, in the language, I would say, Inda Louise, my name is Rebecca Sockbeson, Njayawug, Bunawupskag. So Njayawug is, for most of my life, I thought that meant I come from Bunawupskag. Bunawupskag is the Penobscot, or Bunawupskag is the Indigenous way to say people that live where the whitewater flows. Okay, so Bunawupskag is where the whitewater flows. And So Penobscot is an anglicized version of saying Bunawupskig. Okay. And so the literal meaning of Enjiawuk isn't I come from, but it is I belong to. So I be Enjiawuk Abunawupskig. I belong to the place where the white water flows. That even the rootedness within the language and the connection to the land is the rootedness of the connection to the land is the language is evidence of that, right? The root words in the language. So as I relay that, I just wanted to, and I'm going to talk a bit about the land dispossession and give some historical context for the paper. The title of the talk is the title of the paper, and there's links to that, but it's a paper that I wrote in response to my Libra professorship up at the University of Maine in Orono, where I did a bit of investigating around the Wabanaki Studies Law, LD 291, an act to require teaching of Maine Native American history and culture in Maine schools. And I had been 17 years since the passing of the bill when I started the visiting professorship at UMaine. And there still hadn't been any real action taken to implement, the law. And in fact, at the time that I did the professorship, the Libra professorship in Orono, the Department of Education curricular resource website had gone dormant, which is now up and running. And there's lots more resources thanks to people in the Portland Public School System and other individuals within the Department of Education and Maine Indian culture preservationists. But that has been, resurrected, and there's some awesome resources there now. But for, well over 15 years, it was dormant. The website was dormant since the implementation of the actual law in 2000. So the paper takes up and addresses the need for mobilizing truth and teaching about Maine Indian people, which is very much, the heart of my scholarly work and research. And one of the colonial documents is this bounty, a 1755 bounty. And just so that I also, stay, I guess, to task here, I'm going to read just a page from a chapter that I published about this, and it gives some historical context. So probably for the next 20 minutes, I would just invite you to open your hearts and thicken your skin. Dr. Verna St. Dennis is a Cree scholar, an anti-racist scholar, and this is her language. When she engages with the difficult knowledge, of Indigenous, studies and content. And in an anti-racist context, I would just encourage you to, open your hearts up and thicken your skin as you listen to the next 20 minutes, which is, it's just hardcore truth and history. And I'll talk a bit about how it impacts us today. So, the Wabanaki initially served as guides and hosts, teaching Europeans how to survive and thrive on the land. And that's pretty universal. I think people understand that in many ways. And however, the Wabanaki values of generosity and hospitality, which are ancestral values, were quickly taken advantage of by Europeans who began the abusive treatment of Wabanaki as early as the mid-1500s. So this bounty on Penobscot scalps is a 1755 document. Okay, so when I published an article in 2008, and it marked the first time a Wabanaki person had done a published academic analysis of this bounty. And you figure 1755 to 2008, it's the first time a Wabanaki person had published in an academic journal, analysis of this document. So you just imagine how subjugated, and the bounty, calls for the scalps of Penobscot peoples, including men, women, and live children. These were all along the eastern seaboard. So it is not just exclusive to Penobscot Indians. This was all along the eastern seaboard in both Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, as well as right down to the Florida coastline. And it marks, when I say Indigenous peoples of North America have survived the largest act of genocide the world has ever known, and up to 97% of original populations of Indigenous peoples of North America have been decimated through genocide. This is the empirical evidence of that. And the colonial document, it has also not ever been apologized or eradicated, this colonial document. So think about that first. So 1755. So when you look at the document closer, it's for every male Penobscot at the age of 12 that taken in 50 pounds. Okay. And then women, the scalp of men, 40 pounds. So we can see where scalping comes from as well, which is totally contradictory to what Hollywood teaches us. There's movies that were just recently put out there, like the Reverend with Leonardo DiCaprio, who is hailed as being a real advocate for Indigenous rights, as a lead actor in this movie, that perpetuates the myth that scalping comes from Indigenous peoples, because at no point in that movie, and this movie hit box office records, like reached millions of people within the first 3 months, and not one time in that movie is a settler, a European settler, scalping a Native person. It's all Native people scalping French and English. And so you just think about how these myths get spread like wildfire, and they continue to get confirmed and perpetuated, even through Hollywood. Okay, so that, the analysis is way overdue, and it continues to be necessary in teacher education. And so I'll get back to the 1500s. So just sort of think about the time frames. Okay, 1755, 1500s. As the Europeans began taking over Wabanaki lands, kidnapping and murdering the people, the Wabanaki began to defend themselves and fight back. The Wabanaki became highly skilled at using European guns they had acquired through trade, with the result that in 1632, this is about 100 years before this bounty, okay? In 1632, English authorities prohibited gun sales to the Wabanaki, yet another way of taking power away from the Wabanaki, and this act also furthered their intended decimation. So from the 17th to the early 18th centuries, the history of the people includes massive massacres. So it made the Wabanaki, the gun prohibition made the Wabanaki unable to defend themselves, right? And so, so during this time, Indigenous leaders developed a political alliance to challenge European warfare, which became known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. So that's the Passamaquoddy, Penobscots, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, and also the Abenaki, which lasted into the 1860s. And today there's a political confederacy that remains. So in the early 1700s, Queen Anne of England commenced compensating her people for Native American scalps, which is this bounty, issuing bounties after prohibiting gun sales to Native people grossly disadvantaged my ancestors. So this specific bounty, this specific bounty was issued in 1755. Okay, so in an attempt to halt the decimation of Penobscots so one of our leaders, Penobscot Chief Joseph Orono, in fight back mode and protection of the people, accompanied by a delegation of Penobscot, pledged an alliance with the English in Watertown in 1818. The Wabanaki and the state of Massachusetts signed a treaty establishing and allocating reservation lands. Okay, so we can also understand in terms of dispossession of land, how we also came to be on this little island on Indian Island, Penobscot Indians. So it's only 6 miles around, right? And it is the home to over 500 Penobscots, which is less than half of our tribal census. And it there's a real overcrowding and housing issue today within the community. And so today, Indigenous peoples in both Canada and the US are the least likely to be homeowners, either on or off reservation property than any other group. So in our homelands, we are the least likely to be homeowners, okay? Ocean and riverfront property especially is even more unlikely to be owned by a Wabanaki tribal member today, okay? And this is deeply rooted in initial colonial land dispossession. So the coast of Maine is identified as one of the most beautiful places in the world. There are over 4,000 islands off the coast of Maine, which accounts for more islands than the rest of the eastern coast combined. The majority of these islands are privately owned and considered prime real estate today. Early colonial records indicate that land seizure was based upon the successful capture and or decimation of Wabanaki peoples. So the Scalp Bounty was enacted in 1755, and shortly after the American Revolution, 1783, land seized by the British were either allocated to soldiers or, in the case of coastal property, sold to the highest bidders. Okay, so I'm going to bring your attention back to this bounty. So you figure for every male Penobscot above the age of 12, 50 pounds, and the scalp 40 pounds. If you do like a ratio equation to today, that is roughly like $50,000. That's certainly enough for, the down payment of a home. And so land seized by the British were either allocated to soldiers or, in the case of coastal property, sold to the highest bidders. Okay. The following colonial account of one of the most coveted fishing areas where the rivers meet the ocean, which is, in Westbrook, reveals how specific towns were named after the individuals responsible for the genocide and this particular colonial oppression, celebrated through the naming. Here we see how the prosperous town of Westbrook, Maine came to be named. Thomas Westbrook was charged with scouting Wabanaki territory in the east, including patrols between the Penobscot and Saco rivers. His commission, as given to him by Lieutenant Governor Doomer, was, quote, "You are to take, intercept, kill, and destroy the Indian enemy in all places where they may be found." So this is, this is a dispossession that I name, as a meta dispossession, because it's beyond dispossession. And it's important that it gets foregrounded, in the context of in developing a compelling rationale for teaching, about these matters. And also in the context of land acknowledgement, we're making land acknowledgements, and how much do we really know about the land dispossession, right? And the intergenerational land possession that occurs and has occurred, right? And so, I offer that, as something to, really consider. And I name it a meta dispossession because of the next wave or era of policy against Wabanaki people, which included our being taken, my ancestors being removed, from reservations, and then put into Indian residential schools, right? So my own story as a Wabanaki woman and researcher, is only one of many as we move along, and think about these matters. But in terms of timing and roles that I've had in my lifetime, and when I was at USM, because I worked at USM for, I think, 7 years. I was also part of this group of the Wabanaki Studies Commission. So we were charged with the implementation of the Wabanaki Studies law back in 2000. And one of the roles that I had and served was supporting the development of the curricular resources so as to be in compliance with the law. And so at the same time, this really, I don't know, I would just say that, if all people on the commission for this to have happened to, it's, things like this happen for a reason, I guess. And so I've published quite extensively about this story as well. So I'm giving you a very abbreviated edition of this, but this particular card is something when my daughter was going to kindergarten in the Portland schools. She had received this from her reading buddy, fourth grade reading buddy at the time she was in kindergarten. And I had asked her, what this image was. And I had been going through her keepsakes in her school bag. And she had said, well, it's the bad pirates killing the Indians. And they play this at recess as well. And so I had said, I was aghast, at hearing this. And I asked her, I actually had nothing to say. And she had responded to me because I was speechless. And she had just offered, she had asked the question, actually, why do they want to kill us? And she was including herself in that. She said that the fourth graders were playing the pirates and the kindergartners were playing the Indians, and they were playing this kill the Indian game at recess. And so it emulated and reflected what she was getting for a fourth grade reading buddy card. So obviously too, the teacher wasn't like monitoring like what the children were passing over, or if she was quite desensitized to this, and so I had, and this, I just want to bring us back to the critical thinking and kids' ability to critically think, and how I started out with bell hooks calling for, the nurturing children to critically think, because she certainly was including herself as being a target of this hate, violence and threat, which at the time I didn't, this was in 2000. I didn't really even name it as such. I had to have, others, colleagues name it. And they said, Rebecca, she's experienced a hate crime. That's a hate crime. It's a threat to her based on her race or ethnicity. Right. And so, so when, there's a lot more context here and a lot more story, but I want to just point out the connection to critical thinking, because I approached the kindergarten classroom, and having been on this Wabanaki Studies Commission, and here we are literally in the week of needing to develop curricular resources for implementation and compliance with the law, this card surfaces, and I'm chairing this think tank of how to, develop the resources. So we had one of what was on the table, and it was actually on the chopping block, was how we were going to teach the bounty, how we were going to teach about the bounty, that colonial document. And there were Maine Indian teachers teaching in Maine Indian schools that were very concerned that if we even put it on the agenda, that teachers would not want to have anything to do with it, and they would reject compliance with the law. And there was a group of elders at the think tank who asked to meet like in private amongst themselves. So we took a recess from, from the think tank, and they went in and met with each other. And after an hour of, meeting, they just came out and unequivocally, unilaterally said, we have to teach about this, about the bounty. I then went on to explain to them my interaction with the kindergarten class that I had, which, was really incredible and really inspiring, and totally embodies this quote that I read from bell hooks, which, the kindergarten teacher was very resistant to having me. She rightfully so, protecting her kindergartners, because I also think that most kindergarten teachers can walk on water. That she had just, she was protective of the kids. And she just said, well, what are you going to say to them? And I just asked her to trust me. And I circled up with them that morning, and I had a paper copy of the bounty. And I asked them about the game. I said, I understand that killing the Indians game has been played on the recess, and there was no, like, they admitted it. Yeah, there was, yes, it wasn't something that was a secret. It was an open game being played. I just said, at one time, Julia and I are Indians, real Indians. And at one time, this was a for real game. And, and people tried to kill Indians at one time. And this game really hurts us. And, there was a little girl sitting next to Julia, and she went locked arms with her, and she just proclaimed, "I am not ever playing that game again. I don't want to hurt Julia." And it was like, kids can critically think, and it's the university student that I work with today that is just now learning these things, that is so bewildered, to learn these truths, that I actually worry more about than a kindergarten's ability to critically think. And not just the student that's bewildered, but the student that is also, full of hate, because they didn't have those opportunities to think compassionately, which requires critical thinking, very early on, right? So, needless to say, there was lots of teachings that emerged out of, that experience. And as a case study, I think I've published at least 3 journal articles, doing the various levels of analysis of this experience. So, but it's wholly relevant to the discussion today. There were lots of mistakes made by the school along the way, and also probably even, certainly I wish, hindsight is 2020. There are different things that I would have done, and probably said to my daughter at the time, because it was really just so, like, rattling, it even to today, right? But it's a story that needs to get mobilized. And the way that the school responded, they could have responded a lot better than they did. So it wasn't until I had pointed out that if kids were playing, throw the Jews in the incinerator, or hang the Black people, then play a lynching game, it wasn't until that point that I made those analogies did the headmaster start to really get it. But because it was Indians, it was like more acceptable, right? So that's something to really consider, and to rethink, right? And that reconsidering and rethinking that requires critical thinking. Okay, and so and I think maybe I do want to talk a little bit about critical thinking. This is her at that age. She's going to be 24 soon here. So okay, so also, just interjecting here, Wabanaki women knowledge, when late Mary Bassett, a Passamaquoddy elder from Sibayak, reminded us and me at a very young age, that we were not supposed to be here. She's talking about that bounty, and she's talking about, what we survived as Wabanaki people. And, she spoke to a group of Wabanaki youth. And when I first heard this, and, it was a very profound time in my life. And that was actually, there's a lot more context. I could get into a great story about that as well. But at the end of the day, and what my point is here is that Mary Bassett, very early on, explained to many of us, young Indigenous activists, the importance of acknowledging that we weren't intended to be here and we're still here, and the significance of what we had survived as a collective, as Wabanaki peoples, and the mobility that I felt in those moments, upon really thinking about that, has made a tremendous impact in my thinking. So what I teach out here now at the University of Alberta, is one of the courses that I teach is Aboriginal education in the context for compulsory Aboriginal education in the context for professional development. It's the province's first compulsory education course for all of our undergrads. We are one of the largest faculties of education in Canada. And similar to the University of Maine system, our faculty, College of Education is, the primary vessel for teacher education preparation, as well as education and administrator preparation as well, and master's and graduate programs. So often, what I teach about in my role in the delivery of this course, we reach over 1,200 students a year in this one course. And one of my roles is the anti-racist thread, to support students thinking around anti-racism. And so I want to share with you, some of that thinking. And as I do that, I will be interjecting, the influences of Wabanaki knowledge, in that process. And so through that, I've done some analysis, and as a Wabanaki scholar, and what I want to talk about really quickly, and when I work with students, pre-service teachers, and I explain critical theory, and I just offer this to anyone. And actually, my mother asked me to recently re-explain this to her because she really liked how I explained it in another talk I did a while back ago. But I invite students to critically think and engage in critical theory, which when I take up critical theory, I introduce it as how we make sense of the world around us and how we can rethink an issue. So in terms of these this difficult knowledge that I'm sharing with you now, I use like a chair as a metaphor for critical thinking. And so maybe I'll even, because of the way I've situated this PowerPoint, I'm going to have to just stop sharing my screen for a minute to show you what I'm talking about. So I'll get back on here. Okay, so oh gosh, now I'm going to have to, this is my late great grandmother behind me. I'm going to have to put her. Okay, there we are. All right, so I'm just going to turn my light on so you can see here. Okay, so hopefully most of you can see this chair. Yeah, I'll just roll it around. There's not much difference between my bookshelf and my chair, but when I talk with students, pre-service teachers, I explain that critical theory and critical thinking requires us to rethink an issue, right? So say for instance, the question that I often get asked is, well, why aren't they teaching about Wabanaki people, or why is it that Wabanaki people are so invisible in the landscape in Maine and in the education process, right? And even content delivery, a lot of the answer, oftentimes a mainstream rhetoric is, well, they're just they just sort of died off, right? And there's really not a lot of critical examination of that, and that's a big problem. And so one of the things that I want to, what I explain when I'm working with pre-service teachers is, engaging with the material, like what I'm explaining to you now, some of the historical context. And this is just like a glimpse of the historical context, right, that I'm offering you, is to think about it, critically. So if I look at this chair as being a metaphor for the invisibility of Native people, particularly in Maine, okay, it's gonna, for me to really understand it holistically, it's gonna require me to go and maybe stand behind the chair, the metaphor for why Indigenous peoples in Maine are so invisible. And, this is not just in Maine, okay, this phenomena isn't just in Maine, but okay, and then I have to look at it from this side of the chair. Okay, and then maybe I've got to come over here and look at it on this side. And then, especially if I am really not familiar with it and I'm having trouble really understanding it, I might even have to get uncomfortable and climb up the wall and hang a bit from the ceiling and look at it a whole different way. And I might even need to get on the floor and get my legs dirty and get where the dirt and dust is and crawl under the chair, and look at it and humble myself and look at it from a different position, right? And so critical thinking and critical theory begs us to rethink the world around us as we've always known it. Okay. And that may even require, holding up a mirror and looking at ourselves too, so that we can better see that chair, right? Better see the issue, right? So just want to get back to the PowerPoint so I can keep myself on track here. So tribal critical race analysis. So critical race analysis, and there's been a lot of talk. I can see even more so in the United States and the media about critical race theory, and critical race theory is really something that's important for us to, understand, as we take up and are, hopefully committed to mobilizing truth. And historical truths and how they impact, contemporary issues. But so critical race theory was actually introduced into the literature by Black civil rights attorneys that encouraged us at the time and continue to look at the systemic issues and how racism and disproportionality is embedded in systems and is rooted in law and policy. And so, for Indigenous peoples, tribal critical race analysis, which Brian Brayboy introduced into the literature maybe 10 years ago. And remember that he drew on critical race theory, okay, which was developed maybe 10 and 20 years before then. Okay, so tribal critical race analysis and theory is a bit newer, maybe 10 years new. But it requires us to look at, for example, systemically, what has happened to Indigenous peoples so that in terms of systemic dispossession. Okay, so in this case, that systemic dispossession is rooted in the reality that Indigenous peoples of North America are the most heavily legislated against group than any other group. So more laws and policies, federal laws and state laws and policies have been written about us to deal with us as a problem than any other group. So our religious freedoms were dispossessed of. Of course, the lands were dispossessed of. There were educational policies that removed our people from our communities and put them into Indian residential schools. So one of the first Indian residential school and the first cohorts of Indian residential students came from Indian Island, Maine, and they were sent down to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And, it's just something that a lot of people have very limited understanding of. Okay, so one of the attempts that I've made in thinking about tribal critical race analysis is how Maine is oftentimes identified as the whitest state in the nation. And it occurred to me, in my scholarly work, as I considered this notion in reality, we're quite neck and neck with Vermont. But, the point is that 94.7% of the state of Maine are white people. And so, to think about that is, and to say, well, Maine is one of the whitest states in the nation, is actually, kind of surface. It's a surface analysis, where tribal critical race analysis would encourage us to look at that more critically and see that, to look back at the genocidal policies, right? And land dispossession rooted in and aligned with the genocidal policies, that Maine has been the most successful at the near annihilation and marginalization of Wabanaki people. And so I published about this, but I was at a conference where there were two Indigenous peoples at an international conference, one Indigenous and one non-Indigenous, and they were both surprised to learn that Maine still had Indigenous peoples, right? And so it's just something to, really consider. And I share with you the need for critical race theory, because it opens up the pathway and the door for us to see the issue in ways that we would have not been able to see it otherwise. And it looks at, of course, those everyday acts of racism, like what happened to my daughter in the school, right, is horrific, okay? And it needs to be dispelled and addressed and taken up, okay? And on a systemic level, the impacts of surviving a genocide is manifested in the high socioeconomic distress rates that we face in Maine, okay? And so understanding that, is complex, but it's not too complex if we are given a full picture of the historical context and the true historical context in which we have survived that genocide, okay? And how it's associated with systemic land dispossession, okay? And so, yeah, I wanted to, also just share with you a bit this, the concept of anti-racist conviction and how I approach this material with the pre-service teachers. And I decided in this, this particular paper that I published has in the title Anti-Racist Conviction, because it's a call for, the taking up of anti-racism, which, in a tribal critical race analysis is taking up, mobilizing the truth, these historical truths that I'm sharing with you. So I usually start out every term, and this is a 200 level undergraduate course. We start out at the beginning, as I'm teaching about anti-racism, I explain, we have them read this article by Barbara Thomas. She's a white woman that is an educator, and she writes a letter to her daughters. And, she's profoundly, situated, the difference between responsibility and blame. Okay. And so we're really clear, and I'm really clear in my own pedagogy. And I would say that this is also in the spirit of also Bell Hooks's influence, but, other Indigenous, scholars as well. But, Thomas says, first, remember that you're not responsible for the wrongs committed before you were born, but you can't escape the legacy of those wrongs. So you need to understand some history in order to understand your current position in the world and what other people's perceptions of you are, right? And you're responsible for what you do now, right? And so I impart upon the undergraduate pre-service teachers the real need to not feel blamed, but to feel responsible for mobilizing truth about this, right? And so, because white guilt can also be terribly immobilizing, and it's important that, I think students in general feel like they have agency, they have the capacity to impact social and political change in education. And so, having the opportunity to mobilize truth and teach, about, Wabanaki peoples, both historically and contemporarily, is empowering. I've experienced this with my students firsthand. Okay, so I shared with you, lots of this already. And I think because I'm already at 4:30 and I was going to go in and explain that the specific history around Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and show that, for many of you that have, been on social media, you've probably seen, and maybe not, some people, how do you know what you don't know? How can you know what you don't know, if you haven't been exposed to this, because it's not part of our mainstream learning within any of our education systems. But there have been up to date, like over 8,000 mass graves found of Indigenous children at these Indian residential schools. And it's important to know that, the first one that hit the media internationally was in Tecumseh back in May in British Columbia. There were 215 bodies of murdered children found, at an Indian residential school site on a Tecumseh First Nation. And meanwhile, now that hit it hit international news, and it also incited the investigation of other Indian residential school spaces. But what a lot of the background and contextual information that is so important to know is that the first Indian residential school that was developed in the United States by Henry Pratt, who in the first cohorts were Maine Indian people that were sent to these schools. So the picture that you see here, surely there were Maine Indian children in here. And then there's a mass grave there with unknown, children's that our names are unknown, and that policy of kill the Indian, save the man was the first wave of educational policy against Indigenous peoples of North America, because it became the educational policy for Indigenous peoples in Canada that Duncan Campbell Scott took on. And so, he and Richard Henry, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, he was the headmaster for the school, but he was a military officer. And he was colleagues with Duncan Campbell Scott, who subsequently and shortly thereafter developed the Indian residential school system in Canada. And so, just some of these, this is a picture of Thomas More. This is a pretty familiar picture, maybe for many of you. This is what happened to a child, how they looked upon going into the school, kill the Indian in order to save the man. So the forced assimilation, and it has had devastating effects on our people, because even just the aesthetic, there's a lot of what has happened to the soul, of generations of children that were, had language beaten out of them, their Indigenous languages beaten out of them. And, children were used as scientific experiments for malnutrition to study, starvation. And children were sexually abused and tormented. It's really deserves its own, probably, course at a university level. And in our course, and our compulsory course for pre-service teachers, we have a whole thread that covers Indian residential school systems and the impacts, contemporary impacts. These are the names of the Penobscots that went to that school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I have ancestors here, and for any of you that are Native that are, looking, and Penobscots, I'm not sure of the rationale for this, maybe because they were closer to the southern border, but they, the first cohorts were largely outnumbered, the other tribes. And this isn't a total list, but these are the first cohorts. So, I want to just, close by imparting upon, to you some more Wabanaki women knowledge. And late Sipsis is an elder and was an elder, Penobscot elder and writer and artist. And, she very early on to a group of us Indigenous activists at the time had, asked us to think about, as Native people, we have to think about white people every day, and white people don't ever have to think about us. And this is something to really consider, as you move through, how you might take up mobilizing the truth, right? Rainey Atian, late Rainey Atian, who, was also a Harvard scholar and a basket maker and elder, takes us up and challenges us, to think about how we can take up, the cleaning product. She says white people often think we're like a convenience store. They like to come in and buy the candy, the M&Ms of our culture and spirituality, and leave behind all the cleaning products like the oppression, colonialism, and racism. And, in teaching, this course that I'm telling you about, the 200 level course, I always end my lectures with this, I think I end my lectures with this, with this quote, and I explain, and I encourage the students to take up the difficult knowledge, which is what Britzman encourages us to do. Britzman writes about, teaching the lovely knowledge versus the difficult knowledge. And anti-racism calls for that, taking up the difficult knowledge. And at the end of one lecture, I had a student approach me, and she had said, "Do you remember me running into you, at the grocery store a few weeks ago?" And she was, visibly to me, she was a white woman. And I said, "No, I don't remember." And she said, I had my twins on each hip, and I had groceries. And I remembered her immediately after she said that. And because at the time, my daughter and I, out here, you have to pay to get your grocery cart. So it's actually a much more eco-friendly way of doing it, but you have to put a dollar coin in the grocery cart in order to take it away. And then it ensures that you put your grocery cart back. So where I live here in Edmonton, there are over 60,000 Native people in just the city. In Maine, there's over 5,000 Maine Indian people in the whole state. You can also see like the impacts of those mass, the mass and the densely populated massacres in Maine. It's also testament to how Indigenous peoples migrated west upon being the attempt to decimate and being removed. So here where I am sitting right now, delivering, this talk, just the city that I live in, 4,000 miles west from you, there's over 60,000 Native people just in the city that I live in. And the people here, my relatives here, have been exposed to settler colonialism for just over 300 years. Whereas on the East Coast, our people have been exposed to settler colonialism for over 500 years. Okay. And so it's important to understand, that context. And so getting back to the grocery store story, my daughter and I, who are visibly Native people, and I will just say that because of those numbers and because of the dispossession of land, culture, the people have survived the same policies that our people back in Maine have survived as well. And it's more recent here. But when you go to the deepest, most impoverished parts of the city where I live, it's all Native people that are, that are the homeless people. And a lot of times they'll hang out to get that loonie from people's grocery carts at the grocery store, right? Lots of homeless people that are visibly Native. So my daughter and I, a Saturday morning, had gone to the grocery store basically in our pajamas, and I had approached this woman because it looked like she needed help. She had twins on her hips and her hands were full of groceries. And I had told my daughter, "Let's go help this woman." And my daughter was like, "No, Mom," like she was hesitant to do it. And I just, didn't even think twice about it. And the woman had refused our help. And I just thought, I just dismissed it as, people just, it's too bad people are not receptive to help. my daughter had a different perspective of it. She was like, she didn't want us to help because she thought we were like begging, we were going to be asking her for her loonie, or she was like scared of us because we're natives or whatever. And so I just thought, no, so being raised in Maine, it's a different experience because Indians are so invisible in Maine. Okay. And my daughter, who has been raised out here, has felt the overt, like really like overt, exact, like open racism against her. Right. And so she knew that woman was why she was resistant. Anyway, getting to the lecture, the student says, I didn't realize you were my professor. She goes, it wasn't until I drove home later, like 20 minutes later, I realized, oh my gosh, that was Dr. Sockbeson, that had approached me. And she said, I just want you to know that, because this is a person that's going to be a teacher. She said, I am so sorry that I didn't, I was carrying my stereotypes about Native people. And she had just said, I want you to know that when I go in to teach, and I just happened to be going to the grocery store because I ran out of cleaning products. She said, and I had cleaning products in those grocery bags. And, and she just said, I want you to know my full intention to teach about, historical and contemporary oppression of Native people. And this class, and these perspectives in this class, has really changed my thinking. So I just want to, encourage you to think about what the impacts of mobilizing truth can have, on your students, on you as a student. I'm assuming that lots of people that have joined the discussion are, educators or, embarking upon education. But and I'll end there. There's lots more to talk about. And I know that we also have some time with some doctoral students, but at the end of the day, I want to make sure that it's, that knowing that we have, as Maine Indian people, we're not only are we still here, but we are also, many of our peoples are still practicing and engaging, in those ancestral ways of knowing and being. And what my research calls for is the privileging of Indigenous epistemologies, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, because there was such a intention to eradicate that, to eradicate our ceremonies. Like, there was a federal prohibition on us to, practice our ceremonies. And it wasn't until the early 1970s that prohibition was lifted. And so, that and the educational policy, to dispossess us of our languages, it had a devastating impact, but it also was not completely successful. And so I want to make sure that it's really clear in my delivery to you here today that although we do face the highest levels of socioeconomic distress than any other group in the nation, in both Canada and the United States, we are so much more than that as Native people. And, when I think about, things like what is Indigenous knowledge, and, Wayne Newell reminds us that, Indigenous Wabanaki knowledge is the knowledge and energy created between us when we have, when we're able to sit with one another and talk with one another. So, critical pedagogy and the dialectic, in many ways honors Wabanaki knowledge transfer. It's that energy, it's not owned by any one person, but it's the dialectic, it's the engagement with others in discussion. So I for real will stop there. And, I know that Kathleen was going to field some questions, and I'm happy to ask, to raise or answer anything as well. So thank you very much. And I'll throw a tomato at me. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much for your generosity in coming to speak to us today. That was really, really just wonderful. Before we take the questions, I'm just going to drop in the chat a link which was forwarded at the last talk I was fortunate enough to hear you give. It's a link to the film Bounty, which also discusses some of the events that you mentioned today. And one of the things that I found impressive about the film is that it comes along with a whole packet for educators to address some of these topics in their K-12 classrooms. So that having been said, as if you came in late to the talk, we've disabled the chat function, so you should be able to chat, but only to the hosts. And if you have a question or a request, I would be very happy to relay them to Dr. Sockbeson so that she can answer them. And the first question that I see is a request. They're asking if you would mind sharing your slides with us.
Yeah, you know what I've had to do, because I've got there's some copyright issues, but I'm also in the midst of, I'm working on a manuscript, but what I would offer is that within and we can figure out how to share this, but I have in the references, and actually maybe Kathleen, if you could share my scholarly website, all of my publications are on my website.
Perfect.
And anything, like within the website, within the publications, you will see, what I'm taking up. And I can offer that.
And I'll also just jump in to say that we have recorded, although a little bit late, I apologize for interrupting you with the recording. We have recorded the evening's talk, and people should be able to access the recording afterwards without having access to all of the slides by visiting the School of Education and Human Development website.
Yeah, and everything is on my scholarly website. So that will be in the chat, Kathleen.
Oh yeah, sorry, I just direct
like,
messaged it instead of.
Oh, here, I'll stop sharing too. Sorry about that.
No worries. We've got another question from Jennifer Chase, who is interested in your pathways to decolonization. And she asks if that's in your publications, and maybe if you could point to any particular ones.
Yeah, that is actually right in the publication. I think it's in the last section of the pathways. Of the publication, which is which you can access here. I'm going to put it in the chat. Oh yeah, you've got it there. So if you get into this, if you go to this website, the link to the article is there. And even the images, within the talk are all in this website. And you're welcome to, use it in any way that serves you. But yeah, the pathways are also all identified there.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Okay, we've got another question from CEC. So she's a middle school teacher in York, and Cecily. Okay, they're currently searching for a critical thinking model that teams of teachers can use to unpack and respond to concerns pertaining to all DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging challenges. So I guess the question is, do you have any thoughts to share about critical thinking models?
Yeah, there is a really incredible resource online in terms of, it's called Rethinking Columbus. And I use it quite extensively. And there's actually a PDF of it. And it gives some incredible curricular units on how to approach teaching about this. And it has a really great unpacking of critical theory as well. And it's a, it has been, it is a, let me see if I can find the PDF. It's just directing me to Amazon, but there's actually a full PDF of it, Rethinking Columbus. That's what comes to mind most immediately. And then I would strongly encourage you to pick up Bell Hooks's Teaching Critical Thinking, Practical Wisdom. Does that answer the question? I mean, there's so much. The lines of inquiry on this are actually really extensive.
Thank you. We have had a couple of additional questions come in, and Cecily, who asked that question, says, yes, thank you. It gives her a good starting point. Libby Bischoff has provided a comment thanking you for the reminder that young children can handle these truths. And she shares that her 8-year-old listened with her tonight, and he was asking lots of questions, especially about the injustices and the bounties, and why anyone would have been so mean, as he puts it. Can you imagine a world where our 4th graders critically discuss this history, and what then is possible when they get to us at university?
Yes, that's such a great comment, a great point. Back in the early, maybe it was in the late 1990s, as we were, putting the law forward and developing the curricular resources, I had the opportunity to speak to the Maine Social Studies Conference. And there were over 100 social studies teachers in Augusta at the Civic Center. And they were the elementary social studies teachers. I had asked the group how many of them were teaching about the Nazi Holocaust, or, had maybe even I was as specific as asking them about Anne Frank's diary or teaching about the Nazi Holocaust. And the overwhelming majority had raised their hands. And when I had asked them how many of them were familiar with that bounty, that I shared with you this evening or this afternoon, there were just a handful, familiar. And so, it was really, a pretty profound insight, to see. And I had also asked a question around what grade are you teaching, Anne Frank's diary? And some of them were as early as 4th grade, which I think is awesome, and some as early as 6th grade. It's that teachers know their students, and how they too are prepared to deliver, the information. But it's better to, make sure that, we stick to, this is what happened. It's like, think about how I talked to the kindergartners in my daughter's class. Like, at one time, this was a for real game, and they were able to understand that this is what happened without being blamed for it, right? But there was a clear sense of responsibility amongst those kindergarten children that they were going to stop playing it, and they were going to support their peer, and they didn't want to hurt her anymore. It's like, teaching and understanding that, at one time, killing the Indians was a for real game, is something real, and that, offers an opportunity for a child to start thinking about, this is a reality and a truth, so that when they, otherwise, if they are, living in a bubble and they get to high school or college and they start to learn this stuff, not only may they be heavily resistant to it, but they may feel responsible for it. And blamed, right? And so it's, the teaching about this early on, is so vitally important. And it's not devastating to children, to learn about it. It helps them critically think. Bell Hooks is, in honor of her and other critical theorists. Paulo Freire was a huge influencer of Bell Hooks, and, he, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, if you're not familiar with that text, please familiarize yourself with that text. I think that our faculties of education need to have Freirean courses that are compulsory as well. But, Paulo Freire, called for the need, to critically think, and in order to change the world. It's like Toko. I had a PowerPoint slide up that talks about, in that context of blame. But Toko is a theorist that I draw quite heavily on. And they say, you can't change the world by cleaning the dirty mirror, right? And it's going to require us to, to take a look at ourselves and, look at ourselves and to clean our face. Our face isn't going to get cleaned by scrubbing the mirror, right?
So in a related question, someone has just identified themselves as an elementary third grade teacher, and shares that she's found it difficult to locate resources that are age appropriate for young children to assist with planning Wabanaki studies. And she's looked at several websites, but she's asking if you can recommend places where elementary teachers can locate lessons and activities for K-3 students that that seem to be available for middle school and high schoolers.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with a Rethinking Columbus text that I did, were we able to get a connect? Yeah, Rethinking Columbus. There's a link right here that Kathleen has actually shared. This one has resources for that age group as well. And a lot of it is, as a pre-service teacher, it may not be having the exact unit and how to do this. I think a lot of it is the first step is understanding and educating oneself. If your pre-service education program, baccalaureate program isn't doing it, okay, because there are very strong lines of inquiry in this area now, but in Indigenous studies, and understand, educational policy of Indigenous peoples and the Indian residential schools and the Indian Child Welfare Act, understand what happened in Maine. There's so many resources that your work as a K through third grade, teacher, in better understanding your position in the world and your relationship to Indigenous peoples of the territory that you're on is an incredibly important first step to building curricular resources or finding curricular resources. So there are some they are out there, and the Department of Education is building that. The Portland Public School System is looking to build it. I don't think that, I think that probably fourth grade, is a really good age to begin, thinking and talking about the genocide of Indigenous peoples of North America, unless your kids are playing Kill the Indian at recess or you sense something, but remember, these teachers didn't sense anything because they were totally desensitized to Indians getting killed and they weren't paying attention, right? And so had they had a stronger hold and grip on the genocide of Indigenous peoples of North America, maybe they would have been more sensitive to what was happening so that they could have been better and more responsive to what was happening on the recess playground and in their classroom, and reading buddy cards being made, right? So some of it isn't just like, okay, I need to learn how to develop a unit. I'm not calling for developing a unit in kindergarten to explain genocide. I'm calling for the holding up of the mirror and better understanding your own relationship to Indigenous peoples of the land on which you occupy, okay? And how that informs your ways of being in the world, how you see the world, how you teach in general. And, I think eventually, by about fourth grade, it's an important discussion to start teaching about. Similar, teach about the Nazi Holocaust. When I explained to that group of social studies teachers, I applauded them, for taking it up, taking up it. I learned a tremendous amount, when I was fourth grade when I first read Anne Frank's diary. I think it changed my perception of the world. It did not, traumatize me. Although I do think I have, blood memory that I felt very sad and I felt connected to Anne Frank, as an Indigenous child. And it was profoundly important for me to read that, when I was that little. But anyhow, I hope that that answers that question.
Thank you. We have another kind of theme popping out in some of the comments about language maintenance for Indigenous peoples. So what do you see as, what is your opinion on the role of recovering Native language for Native peoples and steps to do so? And do you have any recommendations for any specific curriculum or texts to support Native language maintenance and instruction?
Well, I teach an Indigenous language revitalization, a graduate course. It's a educational policy course. And I work with Indigenous language preservationists, revitalization experts working in their communities, predominantly within the graduate course and in our graduate program. It consists of that archetype, of a person. Some of the reading that I have them embark, or some of the reading that I have them engage with, is an author. Her name is Skutnab-Kangas, Kangas. She writes about, or they write about, linguistic genocide, linguisticide, and the intention to eradicate people's languages, Indigenous people's languages, and the impacts of that. That is something that, that I think is probably one of the, some of the stronger, pieces of scholarly work, in the literature. And for a lot of the students, the Indigenous students that I work with, the graduate students, and mind you, they're working in their communities to revitalize or preserve their language. And there's a whole line of inquiry on this. And, if you can email me, I can send you the reading list that I use in the delivery of this course. But bottom line, when I work with these graduate students or other community people, there's something more Wabanaki woman knowledge. Late Mary Bassett, who, I showed you a picture of her and her daughter, Esther Altivator, that, Mary Bassett was imparted upon me that it's not our fault. Like, the language dispossession is actually not loss. And, I write about this in my scholarly work too, that, I lose my car keys, like I actually do lose my car keys quite a bit, and I can be absent-minded, but I didn't lose my language. So even though I have minimal fluency in my language, I didn't lose my language. There was an attempt to systematically dispossess me of my language. And when I understand that a systematic dispossession has been attempted, I then have more agency to reclaim it. And I know that it's not just my fault because I stopped speaking my language. It wasn't a choice that I made. It was actually a part of the colonial agenda to attempt to eradicate my people's physically, as well as ways of knowing and being, which is epistemicide. So it's, I often explain to students, because we carry a lot of shame about that, like we carry a lot of shame about not speaking our language. And, also simultaneously at the same time, it's our responsibility to reclaim the language. We're the only ones that are going to be able to do it. And it's our responsibility as Native people to reclaim the language. So it's like, it's not our fault that the fluency is so low, but it is our responsibility to bring it back or to preserve it.
And maybe we have time for one more question here. Someone has asked for your perspective on the negative backlash to the 1916 project and how that might intersect with raising consciousness to the history of Indigenous people and decolonization.
I'm not really familiar with what you're talking about, so I need more like, like which 1916 project?
I was
It's
hoping
the
you would know.
1619 project.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I transposed the numbers. The 1619 project. Jeff?
Right, which is an effort to reconstruct our history and to tell the truth about the origins of our country, basing it on that 400th year anniversary in 2019. And so I was just looking at the book that was published. I don't know the woman's name, who was a New York Times journalist. Anyway, it follows along just what you're saying, Rebecca. And I think that the question is about the backlash in many ways to so many of the things that we're seeing, that as we tell the truth, as we do the type of work, there's a great deal of the resistance becomes even more overt again and more intense.
Oh yeah, the resistance is unbelievable. And the resistance to mobilizing, the truth is, and this is like, I think that this is a really important question, because this is where I think white people and specifically not just non-Indigenous people, but also generally non-Indigenous settlers, so also color settlers, as well as white people, have a distinct responsibility for mobilizing the truth, because the racialized dynamics that occur when I stand in front of a lecture hall or even in the Zoom, there is a tendency for what I have to say to get dismissed, because I'm just an angry Native person about my past. And, I'm just angry about the past. And so regardless of being a Harvard educated scholar or a full professor, or, that gets thrown out the window. And there's a capacity to do that. And that's the nature of white supremacy. And I do really firmly believe that white people have tremendous agency in mobilizing truth, because you've got, when my white colleagues or non-Native colleagues, settler colleagues, talk about these matters and mobilizing the truth, what they have to say is not getting reduced to them just being angry about their past. So yeah, there is lots of resistance. And how do I, address that? I make sure that at one point in my life, I wasn't as dedicated as I became dedicated to publishing in peer-reviewed A-listed academic journals. That became increasingly important to me, and now it's not. So now that I've done it, it feels like, like I want to write different things and, and have more freedom in my writing. But it feels like it's also been my contribution to the lines of inquiry. So yeah, I don't know if the 1619 project, Nicole Hannah Jones. Okay. Yeah, I would be interested to learn more about it. It's nothing that I can really speak to specifically, because I'm not familiar with it. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Libby Bischoff has provided us with some additional information and a link, which I just copied and pasted for everybody to see. It is just about the end of our time together this evening, but Dr. Sockbeson, thanks again so much for putting together this presentation, for coming to speak at USM now twice this fall. And it's really just a wonderful pleasure. And we particularly appreciate your attention to all of the educators in the audience, and providing such wonderful resources for us to draw on. I think that now we're going to ask everyone to leave the Zoom, except for students in the Muskie Educational Leadership PhD cohort who are invited to remain on the Zoom to talk informally with Dr. Sockbeson.
Yeah, and I see if you're a student, I would say I see Nolan Altivator on there. If you're a student, would you be open, Jeff, to having any students? Or, I would just
Yes,
think if
that's
anyone
fine.
wants to
Then,
stay
yes.
on, just stay on. But Jeff, it's your class, your call. Like,
Yeah, I think
putting it out
I
there.
like the invitation to student. I would really like to have that voice and that opportunity be open. That's fine.
Sure. Yeah, but anyone that wants to stay on, please just do so, and just know that we want to privilege student voices. And I'm going to can we take a break or?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come
Okay.
back at 7:20 here, which is 5:20 there.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So
Okay.
we'll take a 5-minute break.
5 minutes. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you.